Welcome everyone to our PNWA February meeting. And I'm really glad that you're here. People are continuing to come in. Today, we're actually going to be talking on genres and the difference between genres, and that includes literary fiction and nonfiction. I actually have put an attachment, a little kind of a what I'm going to be talking about in the chat room. If you aren't able to download it, just email me at pbinder183@aol.com and I'll send you a copy. For those of you who attended our mini conference in January, and if you did, raise your hand. We had a great time, and what we would love to hear from you is terms of what worked for you, what didn't work for you, what you would like to see more, because as you know, we're going to be in the process of actually doing a conference in June, maybe May, June, somewhere like that, another mini conference. And of course, our big conference in September. And because you are here, we are really looking to see if there's any success stories, because we're going to have a panel at the conference in September on all of the success stories that you have had pertaining to PNWA Conference 2020. I actually got a email yesterday from Avis, one of my former students, and she just got a contract from Wild Rose Press. So I'm very excited for her, and she's over the moon. And so she will obviously be in our panel. So please send us any kind of email, send us emails on what workshops you would like. If you have any publishers or agents that you have been dreaming that you would love to have contact with, let us know that as well. And remember, our conference is September 16th through the 19th. May even have it open up the 15th. We haven't decided yet. We might expand it. So watch for the details on that. We're also looking for more opportunities and more chances for you to speak with agents and editors. So we're looking to see how we can do that. And then remember, our March 18th meeting is going to be all about really honing that proposal that you're going to send in for a contest or to your agent or editor. So it's going to concentrate on the first chapter. And then you can also break out into critique groups afterwards to critique your synopsis, excuse me, or the first three of the first chapter. So anyway, so I'm talking really fast because we have a lot to do today, and I'm going to just do a really quick, brief overview of the definitions that are from genre and literary fiction, and then I'm going to open it up to our wonderful panel. And all the panel members, I want you to raise your hand. We've got Terry and Jim and Darcy and Jerry and Bill and Deanna and Deb. Did I miss anyone? Raise your hand. Okay, there they are. Okay, so we're going to get going. Okay, literary fiction. In literary fiction, careful use of language, style, and technique are often as important as subject matter. Young adult and middle grade, the primary difference between middle grade books and young adult is that middle grade is basically the age group. So think middle school is basically for the middle grade, and high school is 13 to 18 is for young adult. They can have the differences also would be the considerations with the themes, reading level, and word count. In fantasy, fantasy tells imaginative tales of make-believe lands, creatures, and people. Magic is often a major facet in fantasy, and readers must willingly enter the writer's realm to understand this other world. Fantasy will usually develop characters who wrestle with the nature of good and evil. Historical. Historical fiction describes fictionalized stories that are set in the documented past. The details of time and place are usually authentic and accurate and may contain actual historical figures. Think Bridgerton is a perfect example. Romance. Romance is the story of a character who keeps meeting the wrong type of people in his or her relationship, or has run into a problem with a current love relationship. The story would focus on the struggles the character faces with the love interest. The whole focus would be on the relationship, although the character may also be dealing with other struggles, such as losing a job, handling difficult parents, etc. Science fiction is a genre of speculative fiction that contains imaginative elements that don't exist in the real world. Science fiction spans a wide range of themes that often explore time travel, space travel, are set in the future, and deal with the consequences or technology and scientific advances. Horror genre emerges from the fantasy genre. It concentrates on the dark aspects of fantasy, and its goal is to frighten the reader. Its pages are populated by demons, vampires, and ghosts, and its settings are usually dark and isolated locations. As in the fantasy genre, readers have to engage willingly with the text and to use their imaginations. Mystery novels emphasize plot. Usually the protagonist is seeking an answer to a crime or to a mysterious event. Characteristics of this style of writing include suspense and a fast-paced style. Thriller is a genre of literature, film, and television whose primary feature is that it induces a strong feeling of excitement, anxiety, tension, suspense, fear, and other similar emotions. If someone told me that a mystery is a puzzle and a thriller is a nightmare. So that's a quick way to think of the differences between them. Nonfiction or informational books, as they're sometimes called, are those which explain known facts about specific topics. These texts must not only be accurate, and that is extremely important in this, but they must also present the information so that it is easily understood. Illustrations are often used to extend the concept as described in the books. Picture books. These books are often associated with younger readers, as the text may appear to be simpler, and there are many illustrations to support the text. Okay, that's it in a nutshell. And so now I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful panel. Again, our panel members are Jim Harris, Jennifer Dowse, raise your hand, Carrie Person, Jerry Russell, Bill Panauer, Deb Snyder, Darcy Carson, Dan Galbraith. Okay.
Pam, could I interrupt just 1 second? You didn't mention anything about memoirs or autobiographies.
We're going to have Bill talk to you about those.
Okay.
That would be Bill. That would be
All right, Bill.
Okay. All right. So since we talked about that, Bill, you're on.
Oh, wait.
So Pam, you want to talk about nonfiction in general, right?
Yes, correct. That's correct.
Okay. So nonfiction, I think, breaks down into, I would say, generally 4 categories. Unless I think of more, but I'm going to break them down into 4. First, as who was it who said that? Joan. Memoir. Memoir, which to me also includes personal essay, which the personal essay is to the memoir what the short story is to the novel. But this is a story where you, the writer, are the protagonist. It is different than an autobiography. An autobiography is about somebody the reader knows before they read the book. Tom Brady wrote a book, it would be an autobiography. John Cleese wrote a book, I read it. It was an autobiography. I read it because he wrote it. Probably no one here is known well enough that people would buy the book just for their name. So they are reading it to read a story. That's what makes it a memoir. You are in it, and the book reads very much like a novel. Told in the first person, sometimes in the past tense, sometimes in the present tense, but it's in the first person, and it's about you. That's a memoir. And that includes, again, personal essay, which is a shorter version of it. So that's the first category. The second is what I would call self-help, broadly speaking. You are offering advice on solving a problem for someone, maybe around writing fearlessly, maybe around losing weight, maybe around starting a business, maybe around overcoming self-doubt. You have either expertise or experience that you bring to bear. This is also written in the first person. And if you are a self-help writer, your platform, very, very important for publishers. They want to know that you have reached people, that you have experience in the world, helping people with whatever your expertise is. Broadly speaking, that's self-help. The other category, in another narrative category, is the narrative nonfiction. Eric Larson writes narrative nonfiction. The Boys in the Boat is narrative nonfiction. You are telling a story that you are not a part of. You are telling a true story about something that happened that you think is fascinating, but you are not involved in that story. Somebody else did it. but you get all the facts and you tell it in a compelling manner. As Pam mentioned, facts, very, very important. Very important. People will let you know if you get the facts wrong. Just like if you're an historical fiction writer, they will tell you if you get your facts wrong. So you're telling someone else, you dig up a story from history, from the past, and you tell it. It reads somewhat less like a novel because you can't really get into people's heads. You have to rely on journal entries, newspaper clippings, unless you try to do something fancy and experimental. But in general, when you're telling narrative nonfiction, you're relying on sources. It's closer to journalism in that way. Yeah. And then the fourth, I would say, is you are exploring a subject sort of in the realm of academia. You have an idea and a thesis, and you wish to explore it. Maybe you explore it through your own writing. Maybe you do research, but you are describing a subject that you want to dive deeply into. Who's the 10,000 hour guy? What's his name? Expertise. You have to get 10,000 hours to be an expert. You know, he's the Harvard psychology professor, and so nobody knows his name. Well,
Malcolm Gladwell.
Thank you. Malcolm Gladwell is a great example. He gets interested in something, he learns about it, and he writes about it. It's not telling a story so much. He's not offering his own personal advice, but he's delving into a subject and exploring it and revealing it to you.
Another one is Michael Lewis.
Say it again and say it loud and proud.
Michael Lewis.
Michael Lewis. Oh yeah. I mean, I also, Daniel Pink, I interviewed him when he wrote Drive. He's great about that. They find something they're interested in, they learn about it, and they write a book to teach you about it. You know, and this is related to people who have a thesis. They have a theory about this is what we need to do about global warming or about race relations or whatever their axe they're grinding or their subject that they want to see change on. They write about that too. It's like an enormous opinion article in the newspaper.
Awesome.
I think those are, what's
So
that?
what we're going to do is we're going to also hold our questions until afterwards because we want to make sure that we get everything done. But it looks like, Bill, you got another thing to say.
I'm done. I think that unless I can think of anything else, I think that covers the 5 categories. There's a lot I could say about those, but if you write, those are the kind of books. And in general, the thing about nonfiction that's different than fiction is in general, the publishers want to know that you have something called a platform. And it's true for fiction now, a little bit more, but it's much more true for nonfiction. They want to know that you have people who are interested in you and can, not always true. There are lots of examples where it hasn't, but in general, publishers want to know that you have reach in the field and you can reach readers on your own. More so,
Awesome.
I think, than fiction writers. Okay. Thank you
So
all. I will answer your questions later.
And remember that we are recording this, so
Yeah.
you'll be able to get a recording of this.
Yes.
All right, Jerry, would you like to step in?
Sure. I'll talk about my wheelhouse, which is romance fiction. So as Pam said, the story with romance is usually places the primary focus on the relationship, which is romantic. And it's usually between 2 people, but I think we need to change that to be 2 beings because I've seen some interesting things done with other things, but it's very open to interpretation these days, let's just say. The relationship is always consensual in this day and age, and it has an emotionally satisfying and optimistic ending, which we know in the business as a happy ever after or an HEA. There are several different subgenres within romance. Might be like set in contemporary times, historical times. It might be erotic, it has a little higher level of heat. Paranormal might have some mystical otherworld elements. Spiritual might do with bringing religious elements into the story. There's romantic suspense, YA, stories that are for a little younger audience. I probably forgot some, but that's what I can think of right off the top of my head. But again, the plot always revolves around a central love story of those 2 people falling in love.
Thank you, Jerry. I couldn't get my unmute thing done fast enough. So Terry, would you like to talk about science fiction?
Okay, sure. So
science fiction is really fun for me. So I think I'll go down through, I have a list as well, just like everybody else does. I'll go down through a kind of off chart. There's probably 50 or 100 of these things, but focused on science. So almost everything I'm going to be talking about is a breakout of how they view science. So what pieces of science, everything from, well, we start out with aliens, whether it's alien conspiracy or invasion or whatever else it has to be. So if it's got aliens in it, typically it'll be in that alien realm. Even though space opera will have aliens, and a lot of other types of books, even regular science fiction, will have aliens in it. If it's focused on the alien and dealing with the aliens themselves, it's usually alien type material. Alternate history is when you take history and change it. Try to think, what if the slaves had an uprising and actually ended up taking over the United States? As a matter of fact, I have one of those books up on my shelf, which is really interesting to see how they operate with the US versus how the whites have done it, you know? So it's that alternate history of what you take, what did happen and you change it around. Then there's the biopunk and cyberpunk, where you're talking about whether it's internet and computer type technology primarily, or if it's biotechnology, genetics, that sort of thing. Again, it's focused on the science itself. Hard science fiction is kind of overshadows a lot of these things, so that if you're really digging deep into the technology, whether it's, no matter what it is, whether it's faster than light speed, or terraforming, or whatever else it is, if you're digging into the technology itself, it's usually hard science fiction, considered hard science fiction, which is a lot of what I write. Let's see, military science fiction is just exactly what it sounds like, war in space. Let's see, parallel worlds would be similar, I believe, to alternate history. Pulp science fiction is basically that kind of throwaway novel where it's very heavily plot driven and a lot of action. They tend to be shorter books, more or less. A lot of pulp fiction is novella size, 60,000 words and less. Let's see what I have. Robot fiction is exactly what it sounds like. Of course, they have romance science fiction and soft science fiction. Again, like hard science fiction is when, soft science fiction is when you have the technology in the background, but you're really not focused on the technology itself. It doesn't have as much to do with the plot or the characters or who the characters are. It's kind of in the background. And then, of course, superhero fiction is considered science fiction, time travel, and space opera, which is basically a cowboy in space. Those are the, I guess, the primary ones. There are so many different ones. Steampunk, a lot of people ask about steampunk. It's just old technology brought into the future. So it's a lot of pneumatics and hydraulics and that sort of thing versus electronics like biopunk and cyberpunk. What I like about science fiction, though, I want to get real quick to say, is how much you can do anything you want. You can have it be a thriller, it can be a mystery, you can have a detective who's using technology or not using technology. So you can write almost any genre into a science fiction story. One of my favorite things, I do like hard science fiction, and I would like to, I'll read this real quick because Ben Bova just died this past October. In his writing book, I love this. He said, "I believe science fiction should encourage people to think. God knows we have enough forms of amusement that discourage the or actively prevent rational thought. Even in most contemporary literature, the emphasis is on the emotional reaction rather than rational thought. Science fiction is the home ground for the thematic novel today. This is his belief. Science fiction can and should be for the thinking reader. And I like that, because a lot of the stuff that I believe is the better science fiction, even the older science fiction, are things that you really have to think about, and are things you have to really get into mentally. It's not just an emotional ride. It's a thought ride. And that's it. I think that's good.
Great, thank you very much, Terry. So Darcy, I know that you write about dragons. Do you want to talk a little bit about, continuing on romance, but also on your subgenres?
Oh, okay. Well, there's lots of subgenres. One thing, I think Jerry did hit all the 7 main romance categories. So I don't know. I write fantasy, which falls into the paranormal, and it's not as big of a category as you normally think. The biggest category in romance, I think they consider it to be category romance, the series, in like the Silhouette Harlequins that they used to have. And then the rest is single title. Everything else falls single title. I did some stats on it. I thought it was kind of interesting. They said 82% of romance readers were female and 18% were male. The average age is 35 to 39, but it's actually getting younger. They're going, the age is going down. One thing I found out, because I looked it up today, they said that in the romance category, 92% of the readers prefer print. 64, and I think this is where the younger ones are coming in, want the e-readers. And then 35% want audio. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I'm not sure if the audio is going up or down right now, but then back to me in fantasy, it's a small category, but it's one I like. That's about all I can really tell you, because I think Jerry hit all the high points.
Very, very cool. So thank you very much, Darcy. So Deb, could you talk a little bit about middle grade and young adult, and what a fast growing genre that is?
Sure. So really, this used to be, I guess, 15 years ago. I work for the library system. I've been working there 20 years. So when I recall things, I think they happened 4 or 5 years ago, and I found out, oh no, it was 2019, 2018. But there used to be a very small category. YA was not considered, a big publishing genre. It was kind of limited. It was, there were books, but there weren't a lot of books. And then a thing called Harry Potter happened, and it really exploded the genre, because people before thought kids wouldn't read unless they were assigned reading in school. That was kind of they have to read, so they'll read these books. And a lot of times they were reading classics, because English teachers like to assign classics. And they discovered that there is this really huge body of kids who love to read. And so that really pushed the young adult genre and the middle grade, because it crosses over. It also, the Harry Potter books did a strange thing and crossed over into adult. And that was a surprise to people too, because adults were reading them with their kids or just reading them for fun. So we've seen the middle grade. Middle grade is defined really as starting about 4th or 5th grade, around, a little lower than that. I have to remember what ages my grandchildren are. Probably around 8 to 10 or 11. So it's before you hit the YA. And YA also, when you said it goes up to age 18, we find it goes up to about age 15 or 16. And kids are then reading at adult level. So they tend to check out or want to read more adult books at 16, 17, 18. But not all. I mean, some kids just like staying in that. So, you have all the subgenres. in middle grade and YA. You have fantasy, you have horror, you have, science fiction is very popular. There've been some great award-winning books written in the science fiction world. You have romance. It's a very big subgenre. Thing I'll say with romance is if you're writing YA romance, the level of sensuality is very light. You may have, it may be more referred to than be blatant and be very specifically written, because you have to get through you have to jump through some hoops for YA, and one of them is school libraries. Public libraries do not like to ban books. Parents like to ban books in schools, and parents have a lot of control when they go to the school board meeting and 100 of them show up and say, we don't want to read our kids reading this book. So you have to be a little careful depending on what your focus is. But I think it's probably one of the, those ages have one of the widest appeals, because you can cross over to adult. Think about the Hunger Games. The Hunger Games is really an apocalyptic, futuristic novel that adults loved and read like crazy. We had book groups with teens and adults in our libraries. So in middle grade tends to be more character focused, because that's what kids are thinking about. They're thinking about themselves and what they're going through. A lot of them are books about kids becoming independent. And I think that's just because that 8 to 10-year-old or 11-year-old is really wants, their parents are bugging them and they really wished, my parents weren't around. And so there's lots of survival stories, lots of stories about, things that happen to kids that probably they wouldn't really like in real life. So, but that's why we read. We don't want to live the characters. We just want to read about them. So yeah, it's, they're really great books. And, if you're trying to write to market, if you're trying to take your adult novel and write it as a YA, you're probably going to struggle with that. But if you really understand a lot of angst, because YA books, teen YA books especially, are filled with angst. And they're usually written in the first person, not always, but a lot of them are written in the first person because it's very personal to kids, that they want to be inside this character and experiencing it. So that's my opinion. You don't have to agree with me.
Thank you so much. So much. That's great. So Deanna, would you like to talk about mysteries and thrillers?
Yay. Yes, I would. Well, I have to say that there is so much crossover amongst the genres, especially Terry. Listening to Terry and talking about the science fiction and the background, and actually Isaac Asimov was somebody who was considered a mystery writer, but I always thought of him as a science fiction writer, but he's in the mystery category. And YA, Nancy Drew, the Hardy Boys, and those kinds of things coming up, they're popular all over again. The kids teenagers like to read that kind of stuff and put themselves in that place. The subgenres in mysteries go on and on and on. I found sites that say there's only 4 mysteries. There's a police procedural, there's a cozy, and there's the sleuth or detective. And then you have the people that go, oh no, there's 14 different subgenres in mystery. There's cozy, which the grand dame of cozies was considered Agatha Christie. And I think I mentioned this last time. She has sold over 4 billion with a B books, although she passed away in the 1960s. And now I think her things would be considered in a different section, but the amateur sleuth, Murder, She Wrote, professional sleuth, and this I don't understand. The amateur sleuth would be like Murder, She Wrote. Professional sleuth is an amateur sleuth in a professional setting, preferably a setting which is unique and intriguing, like Dick Francis. I think I read everything that he wrote twice. I just absolutely loved him. Tess Gerritsen, legal medical thrillers. and Rizzoli and Isles. A lot of these people's things go on to be television series, suspense, romantic suspense, another big crossover. Nora Roberts. Probably Nora Roberts is in the running and right behind Agatha Christie for a number of books sold. I would have to guess. Historical mysteries, and there you have the real serious people like Kelly Rimmer, The Things We Cannot Say, that goes back to Russian and World War II and sad things. Those aren't my favorite because they get really depressing and sad, but still, historical mysteries are very big. Mixed genre, and that's where Isaac Asimov falls in. He falls into the mixed genre part. Private Eye, Magnum PI, and mostly private eyes are considered sometimes badly behaved, but always have a good guy code in the private eye sector. Noir, those are gritty, deep, happen in the middle of the night, and often they're turned into a movie that you have to watch really hard because it's mostly filmed in the dark. Crime is something that, like Demons and Angels, there's a ticking bomb in the background, and if the mystery isn't solved, then the Vatican is going to be blown to pieces, kind of a thing. And one of my favorites, and the last one I'll talk about, is The Caper. The Caper is Janet Ivanovich's Stephanie Plum, or How to Steal a Million with Audrey Hepburn. That's a movie that's now 50 years old, but it's a fabulous representation of the caper mystery. So mysteries have the same things that everybody else has. They've got a plot. They've just got a big thing happening in the middle that you have to solve. And I think this is where, again, Terry's definition comes in. And I'm just a big fan. So if anybody has any questions about mystery, I'd be glad to help.
Great, thank you very much, Deanna. So Jennifer, would you like to talk about horror and anything that in the fantasy sci-fi world that you think we should revisit?
I am going to zag and say women's fiction.
Okay, so awesome.
And I'm going to say that is basically, it's the three to remember: for women, by women, about women. And it's focused on the women's journey, is what the word on the street is. From agents and editors, I've heard that you can go, if you're doing two perspectives, which I see a lot in women's fictions where they're doing two POVs, it has to be more in the woman's POV. So it has to be, they're hoping for 75% women's POV and 25% men's, but over 50% women's is what they've been telling me. And yeah, what Jerry was saying about romance crossing over to not just humans. Yes, it can be about creatures too, because that's what I'm writing right now. But there's my 10 cents.
So I think that this, we also want to touch on literary fiction. Jim Harris, would you like to have anything to say about literary fiction and how you define that? Oops, you have to unmute yourself. So Jim, you have to unmute. There you go.
Sorry about that. Literary fiction is something that it's hard to define because almost every category can end up, every fiction category can end up as literary fiction if it's a great book. To me, literary fiction would be a John Steinbeck or Ernest Hemingway, Margaret Atwood. Writers of that quality, of that ilk, would be literary fiction. strong characters, strong storyline. It could be a mystery, it could be science fiction. It could be, it could even end up as sort of a memoir as well, to take a page out of Bill's repertoire. Because memoirs, to me, could be a story about somebody in your family who won the Congressional Medal of Honor during World War II, but you never met that person. And you're telling the story based on letters and everything, and you create dialogue. So it could end up as a memoir as well. So to me, literary fiction is a very broad category.
Thank you. So I actually would like a discussion on the difference between romance and women's fiction, because in romance, you also have multiple points of view, and it also can be a woman's journey. So does anyone want to tackle what the difference is, how you define a difference between romance and women's fiction? Anybody? Anybody?
I'm gonna say Jerry is gonna say happily, you have a happily ever after, or happily for right now for romance. You don't need that for women's fiction.
So Jerry, what would you say?
Yeah. Women's fiction really focuses on one woman's journey. There was Amy had a comment about two protagonists. That could work. I've seen it done before, especially if they're in two different time periods and they're writing parallel stories. But it doesn't have to be that. That's the beautiful thing about fiction. You can write about anything, but it does really need to focus on that person's journey from the beginning of the story to the end, and the things that they go through and how they come out of it different than when they started. Whereas in a romance, you have two people that start the story in a certain place. And again, they do have that growth arc that they go through in the story, but somewhere in the story, their growth arc starts coming together as their relationship starts coming together. And it's almost like they need each other to get to that end point together. And that they have satisfying emotional for now or for happy ever after at the end of the story is really important. Whereas in women's fiction, you can leave the story in a place where they're just in a better place or in a different place than they are when they started the story. That's my 2 cents.
I like to make a comment because I would not consider myself a romance reader. And yet I read some of Jerry's books because it had the magic word Templar. And I'm a big fan of books on the Knights Templar. So when I was reading her books, I was focused on the Knights Templar aspect of the story rather than on the romantic part of the story. And I found them very enjoyable.
Which is why I have a higher number of male readers, is because I have battles and things in my books.
Score one for the good guys.
Very cool. So I think that they also was a question, was a mainstream versus literary. Mainstream, that's actually, we did that because a lot of times, and this is why we're focusing on this genre panel so much. We focus on this twice now, once in January now, is because a lot of times people aren't really sure what they're writing. And today more than ever, you really do need to know what kind of book that you're writing. And so so you're not necessarily writing literary, but you maybe aren't sure what you are. So it's literally putting that mainstream literary for those people who are not sure what they are writing. A little piece about literary is that you will see literary aspects in every single genre. And these days it's more and more important that you incorporate those literary aspects. And what that means is that your genre, whatever it is you're writing, is character driven, not plot driven. It must be strong in character development. Terry. Oh, you have to unmute, Terry. Yeah.
I wait till I'm called on, then I have to look for it. So, yeah, I agree a lot. One of the things I look at for literary works are focus on the sentence how long they are, how short they are, how varied they are, the sentence structure, a lot more of precise word choice, internal dialogue. But you're right, it's necessary for all things. When I teach classes on voice and things like that, I often will bring things like Greg Bear, who we've had speak before, and he is like a literary science fiction writer. Is his sentence structure, and he'll have whole paragraphs that are one sentence. It's just the way he manipulates the language and the word choice and how he develops the character that becomes a little bit more intense and I guess in depth. I look at mainstream as very plot driven as well, except that if it's a literary mainstream, again, we go back to the fact that, you know, they're focusing on all these other aspects of writing. So it depends on how deeply you're getting into the craft and how you're manipulating that craft while you go through and how well you do that. Yeah, go Bill.
Well, yeah, I just want to add one thing about literary, I think that often stands out is that unlike, I actually talked to William Gibson about this a lot, who's a science fiction writer, and we were talking about genre. And what he said about genre, which I think is really true, he said, the reader has an expectation of an experience. He said, and for him, he struggled with that. He got tired of delivering that experience. He wanted to do something different. So he started busting out of it. The thing about literary is there is no expectation of a story experience. There is no expectation of happy or sad. There is no expectation of will the character die at the end. They may die. The protagonist may die. There is no presumed knowledge of where that story is going. Whereas in a lot of the genres, I know when I was reading deep in the genres, there was a thing I wanted, and if it didn't give it to me, I wasn't going to read that genre. So there is a broad, which makes it sometimes a little harder to sell because it's harder to define what you are giving the reader, but there is no expectation around the story. It can take place anywhere, anytime, any place. There are no restrictions to where it can even be placed in an imaginary world. So I do think that's one of the challenges of selling it and one of the perhaps freer aspects of writing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I like that. I like that idea because I read a lot of literary fiction, and you're absolutely right. You don't know where it's going to go. You just don't know.
And the other thing, which is a little trickier, which is that there are literary books that are very plot driven. John Irving writes very plot driven books, but they aren't necessarily, because in general, they have a sort of, why am I telling this story? What is the message it's delivering is ultimately more important than the story. The story is important, but there is and that's why you can have literary books like Ulysses by James Joyce, where there is almost no story at all. And yet it's considered the greatest novel ever written. Debatable, whatever, but there it is. So there is more to it than the story. Nothing wrong with a good story, but the message, the meaning of it is ultimately more important even than the language, I would say. And
so our goal was to end at 7:15. However, there's some really amazing.
God.
We can't because there's some great questions. I have a question. If the protagonist in a memoir is within the ages of 15 to 18, would that memoir lend itself to target YA or women's nonfiction?
I don't think the age of the protagonist, for now, from what I understand of memoir, if it is written from the first person and it happened to you, it's memoir. Now, they may start genreifying memoir, but it hasn't happened yet to my knowledge. Basically, if it happened to you, it's a memoir regardless. And if you're an adult writing about going through your difficult childhood, it's a memoir, and probably adults are reading it. Unless, and I would not be surprised if this happens, they start targeting things towards young adults in particular, wanting to read about other young adults having an experience. But for now, it seems to just be memoir, period, regardless how old the protagonist is.
Okay.
Looks like Deborah's got something to add to that. Maybe she's got some knowledge that I don't.
She always has something she wants to say. One difference in that is sports books, because a lot of memoir sports books are targeted to the YA audience because kids tend to be in sports in high school. So you see a crossover there, probably with like K-pop stars, and K-pop being music you don't know what that is, South Korean music. So there, musicians, artists, and some biographies too that kids read for school or read for pleasure, just to get an idea. Those cross over, but you're right, a memoir, and they are by sports figures. They're somebody who, you know, made it, and they're just writing about their childhood, how they grew up, and who influenced them, and that's the kind of story in that memoir. But
and that's going to be very and the stories written by the people here are going to be memoirs. Those are really autobiographies. And
well, they write them themselves a lot.
They write themselves, but they are going to be sold based on their notoriety,
Right.
as opposed to anything written here is going to be sold based on the story. And and for now, those tend to just be all under the broad category of memoir for at the moment, although that's always subject to change.
Things are always changing.
Yeah.
Okay, in mystery, can Deanna please talk about the female sleuth or female private eye as a subgenre of its own in mystery? Oops, you have to unmute, Deanna.
It's changed a lot since Cagney and Lacey and females were only cops, and now they're gritty. They get to engage in murders. They have their own problems. They're recovering alcoholics, and it's not Miss Marple and it's not Murder, She Wrote anymore. It's women with strong backgrounds, women with weak backgrounds, women that have overcome a lot, have been married 3 times, and female sleuths, I think, in certain areas are really coming into their own. So
thank you.
That's my opinion.
That's great. Good opinion.
Can I make three short comments about what I've heard so far? When I worked I spent most of my working career working for publishers, book publishers, major publishers in New York. And we could not wait to have a book, quote, banned in Boston, unquote. If that book was, if any of our books were ever banned anywhere, our sales skyrocketed.
Well, that's what actually happened to the Da Vinci Code, because it was banned by the Catholic Church and it went on the bestseller list for another year. So
YA was always a category that we struggled with as a publisher, because a lot of YA books we found out also ended up in the hands of slow adult readers. And we always hated to put a category of young adult on a book that we thought had that kind of a market. So that was something that we always struggled with for the 20 years that I worked for Crown Publishers. And you have to be careful if you change your categories after you've developed a following. And I can point to Judy Blume, who was writing all kinds of great stories for kids, and then she wrote a heavy breather adult novel, and she got into all kinds of troubles in the 1980s, I believe. J.K. Rowling changed categories and became a mystery writer as well as the Harry Potter books, but she took a nom de plume to write the mysteries. And created a whole new market for her until somebody blew the whistle and said, oh, this is really J.K. Rowling. And James Rawlins, who has participated in a PNWA writers conference that writes thrillers where there's a historical aspect to it. And I was reading one of his books, and all of a sudden out of the blue, or out of the earth actually, came vampires, werewolves, and zombies. And I asked him about that. He said, yeah, well, that was my co-writer. And so I realized I'm not reading any books where he has that co-author.
There you go. So another question, when I hear agents look at wish lists, I hear a lot about upmarket, but as far as I can tell, no one seems to agree on what exactly that means. I'd love to hear your take on what upmarket means. Anyone want to take a stab at upmarket? Maybe, yes, Deb.
Okay, I'll take a stab at it. Somebody kind of really did identify it as book club type books. They tend to span the genres. It can be a romance, it can be women's fiction, it can be a mystery, but they're books that lend themselves to discussion. Lots of times there are even discussion questions in the back to lead book groups. They tend to be focused on solving human problems, not necessarily, said lots of genres. I don't see fantasy and science fiction in upmarket. It tends to be focused on what people are a stage they're trying to get through at life, or dealing with things like a family member has cancer or they have cancer. Debbie Maycomber once said that you could tell some of these books by the number of chairs on the cover. If there were three, it was three sisters going through something. If one of them was turned over, somebody's going to die. I don't know if that's true, but I looked at a lot of the covers and read those books. So yeah, it tends to be harder to define, like all of these genres are, because they cross over. But books that read at a little bit higher level, most books are written at like 10, 11th grade level. They tend to be a little bit higher and can be snazzy books too. I was just reading about, books that are coming on the market now, and they're kind of rich women with problems, getting to be a bigger push now. They can be romances, but they also can be career women who are struggling. So the topics are pretty wide, and they can have a romance in them too. Jerry will tell you, they can have a romance. It's just not the focus of the book. Usually there's a problem. The problem has to be solved somehow to come together. And they're not necessarily happily ever after kind of ending. They can be, I've solved the problem, I'm going to move on with my life type books. So I don't know.
I just saw a question, and I've seen quite a few of these, and a lot of everyone is talking about even science fiction. There could be, say for example, what is there dragons? Is it a science fiction or is that fantasy? If there's vampires is in a mystery, is that mystery or is that fantasy? So could we talk about what element, what in a book will define it? So in other words, if there's vampires in a mystery, will it be considered a mystery or will it be considered a fantasy?
I think
Terry.
it's both.
Yeah, first of all, I think you're right. It's probably both, but it depends on how much time. It's kind of like what you guys were talking about earlier. It's how much time you're spending on one of those elements. And if it's 50-50, it's harder for the reader to identify with what it really is. So typically most books will focus on one thing. Now, the dragons and science fiction thing is interesting to me because it depends on where that comes from. If it's coming from science somehow, then perhaps like you're genetically combining this with that and you end up with a dragon, that's very science oriented. If it's just strictly a fantasy where there's dragons and griffins and all these other kind of things, that could be more fantasy. So look at the depth at which you're using science that's actually around, only pushed forward, right? So we're pushing the science way forward, and we can do that in a lot of ways, including, like I said, genetic changes or cyberpunk type things, maybe the dragons inside the computer, or somehow the technology from between that and 3D printing creates a dragon, so it just depends on how you approach it, I think, when it comes to separating some of these out, and how much time you spend on that particular thing will tell you whether or not it fits in that line or the other line.
I can relate to the dragons and I'll say romance, because I wrote a book that was dragons and romance, and marketing didn't know where to put it. I had to rewrite it because it was so heavy with the dragon and put back in the romance. so that it would seem more romance, but it still came out of fantasy, considered a fantasy romance, but it was almost 50-50. So talking like science fiction and dragons, the reader is going to get confused, and so is the publisher or marketing or a bookseller. They're not going to know where to place it, and all that counts.
We have a question about what is horror.
Something I don't like. Horror is it's the scary stuff to me.
Okay, I got this.
Oh, good.
Okay, so I put it in the chat, everybody, if you need that. Basically, it's, see, I like old school horror. I liked it before it was all creating, you know, all blood and yuckiness, but basically it instills a sense of dread in the reader through frightening images, themes, and situations. It's, you know, character focused just as much as atmosphere. It's The Quiet Place, you know, can be horror just as much as a Stephen King book could be horror. If it's grossing you out, it's horror.
I
There's
would
a-
add
there's also
one more
there's-
thing to that. The horror is something that's going to scare you to death. And it
this-
may not be something physical. It may just be a psychological scare.
Right. Well, this is a definition. It concentrates on the dark aspects of fantasy, and its goal is to frighten the reader. Its pages are populated by demons, vampires, and ghosts, and its settings are usually dark and isolated locations. Think Gothic. As in the fantasy genre, readers have to engage willingly with the text and to use their imagination. A common attribute in horror literature is the battle between the hero or heroine and the forces of evil. So it's dark, dark, dark.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think I often think of Gothic horror, but I think it's when you care so much about the characters that those influences, whether they be ghosts or monsters or human beings or just horrible human beings and murder people, you're frightened for the hero or heroine. That main character, you're scared for them as you're reading because you don't really know how it's going to come out for them. So it's not always about scaring you, it's about scaring you for the characters because you're worried about them.
Well, this has been fantastic. This looks to me like it could go on and on. Did we miss any really questions that we didn't answer for you?
Kim, can I ask something that someone said? They asked, what is the best genre to write? And honestly, the best genre to write is the one that you're most interested in, because writing is hard enough. If you are not interested in what you're writing, just because you think it's going to sell better, you are going to fail. So write what is in your heart and write it the best you can, because that in itself is going to be successful. Anybody else can add stuff to that?
That's absolutely
Yeah.
100% correct. Yes.
And they
Yes.
were saying like one person was saying that they write 3 genres and what should they concentrate on? It's like Jerry said, I write 4 different genres and I go between them depending on my mood. And or when Pam challenges me to write something, which is what happened last time. But it's just what you're feeling. It's what's going to come out of you and come out the best.
I think it's more than like, Jerry. I think it's write what you love and what you love to read.
And what you love to read. That's correct.
Oh yeah.
You can't, if you don't like to read romance, you cannot write romance. Same way with mysteries or science fiction or fantasy or literary, whatever it is. If you don't like to read it, you can't write it. So it's pretty much that simple. So thank you all for joining us with the genre. We are going to continue. So we are going to be breaking up into critique groups, but we do want to thank you very much for coming. And we certainly would like to know if you want to have a repeat of this, because I think that this is actually a fantastic topic. And just let us know. I would like to know, before some of you maybe duck out, We know we have some people from Arizona. Where else? Where other exotic places other than Washington are people from?
From New York originally, but here I am.
Well, see, there you go. There you go.
I want to ask Jim Harris what part of New York he's from.
Westchester County?
West Joe, you're upstate.
Well, just north of the city.
Yeah,
No, he's
that's upstate enough.
No, I'm
To
from
me, upstate
Syracuse.
is where my friend lives near Albany. That's upstate.
No, Syracuse is upstate, where I came from.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's two of us from Hawaii here.
Oh, nice. Oh, Hawaii.
Aloha.
I'm from Nebraska.
Nebraska?
But I'm a 5th generation Washington State native. So
Oh, but you're currently from Nebraska?
I currently live in Blair, Nebraska.
Oh my gosh, this is awesome. So Nebraska, Hawaii, and Arizona, and all over Washington. I love that. That's
Hey,
Or
Pam,
Idaho?
Pam, I have one more question that I didn't get answered, and hopefully it's a quick answer. In addition to my memoir I'm working on, I'm thinking of doing a book of quotes, and I'm wondering what genre that would fall in, if any.
So Bill,
it's nonfiction. I mean, it would be like a gift book, coffee table book. Well,
Okay, so if I was going to pitch to someone,
nonfiction.
just nonfiction general.
I mean, it depends if the quotes are. Are the quotes gathered around a topic? You know, then you would pitch to a publisher who's interested in that topic. But they're focused around something. You know, not just quotes about war or peace, but usually it's a subject. So you'd want to pitch it to a publisher that deals with that subject.
Okay, so if it's a variety of different quotes about different things, would that?
Yeah, I mean, this is not my area of expertise, that particular kind of book, but my experience with those books is they are like quotes to get you through a hard night, quotes for writers, quotes for expectant mothers. Usually there's a audience for the quotes.
In my world of publishing, that would be called a reference book.
There's another,
Really?
Yeah.
Reference book.
Yeah,
Okay.
my book actually got shelved in reference. I don't know why, but because it's about writing, that's where they put it. So you never know.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all, and thank you to our panel. You guys were awesome. So for all of you who would like to stick around, we're actually going to be breaking up into critique groups. So we will say goodbye to those who have other duties to perform. Bye, Bill.
Bye.
Bye, Darcy.
Bye.
Bye, you guys. See you in March.
I'll see you in March. Yes, absolutely. See you. Bye, Terry.